Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live webinar. I just want to make sure that folks can see my screen. I think I'm sharing the screen that says live webinar, validations for non-US vendors before you add them to your vendor master file. And so if you don't see a full-size screen of the webinar visual, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that it's doing well, because where I should be able to see that what screen you're looking at, that's not quite popping up right now. So if you can't see it, let me know. Otherwise, I will continue. So welcome to this webinar today. We are going to talk about how you can verify your vendor is real, how you can validate registration numbers and non-US addresses for your non-US vendors. Now, before we begin, some housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. We will send you a link to the recording within 3 days. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. We'll save for the Q&A session during the last 15 minutes. And if we don't get to all of your questions during the Q&A sessions, additional questions can be asked via email. I'll give you an email you can send those to. Or if you did ask them during the Q&A session or during this session today and I just didn't get to it, I will definitely answer via email. And then lastly, don't forget to download the handouts. There is a PDF of the presentation along with a client brochure. Now, I first want to introduce myself in case you don't know who I am. I am Debra Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my saying putting the AP in happy, love accounts payable. Although some days that AP means apple pie. So just saying, it is the pandemic, and I am sheltering in place, have been since March. Now, as a previous AP senior manager, managing a team of 17, processing over 2,000 vendor requests per month, I also managed global payments for 2 years where we had a large non-US vendor population. And so now I work with AP vendor teams that are still fully or partially manual. And let's face it, many of us have at least one or a few manual processes that are still out there. But I work with them to add authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices. I do have a site that is dedicated to the vendor setup and maintenance process, where I have some free resources, and I'll talk about those, and tools, including a blog and a podcast, both known for providing actionable steps to help you with your vendor maintenance issues, including the collection and update of vendor banking details, and also how to handle non-US vendors. Okay, so looking at the agenda, we're first going to talk about global fraud, and then I'll briefly talk about my proprietary 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process called Authentication, Validation, and Management, so that you can pay the right vendor. And then we'll go through the validations that I recommend for non-US vendors, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. So let's talk about fraud in accounts payable. Now, in the US, looking at the US first, and I know this is on, this webinar is on non-US, but looking at the US first, this US map and the stats are taken from the FBI 2019 report of IC3 complaints. Now, you can check your state to see where you fall. Total complaints for last year averaged about 1,300 per day. And I wanted to point out that business email compromise, you know, where fraudster attempts to trick AP team members into believing they are a CEO or a C-suite level or any finance employee that can can request payment or a vendor to add or change vendor bank details, diverting payments. That resulted in more than $1.7 billion in losses. And of course, BEC started to rise in Q2 2020, but even in Q3, it continued to rise even 15% higher than Q2 2020. And again, this is not surprising due to COVID-19. And the reason I wanted to keep this in related to the US is that you're finding the same thing, right, in globally. So this is a global issue. The International Criminal Police Organization, or Interpol, is an intergovernmental organization with 194 member countries, and in October 2019 they launched a public awareness campaign for business email compromise with the hashtag BEC Careful. So the key here for global fraud is to really be proactive in implementing authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices, and that includes vendor validations. And now that we know, and we probably already knew, right, that this is a global issue, and we know that if fraudulent payments don't go out, it saves your company money, and it also gets your vendor paid faster. But what we haven't talked about is the effect on you or your team. And while you know fraud is evolving, what you may not be aware of is so are the actions that companies are taking against employees. Now, here in the US, I have only heard of employees being let go, but in the UK, there are at least 2 incidents where companies are taking stronger actions. The first one, a worker was fined $7,500 because he wired 3 payments totaling almost $512,000 without confirming with the client. In the second incident, an employee was actually sued because she paid a cyber criminal what netted out to be $138,000 that they couldn't get back. Now, the judge did rule in her favor, but in one subsequent article, she stated that she really considers herself unemployable due to that lawsuit. Now, another one, which is more recent here in Australia, actually it wasn't more recent, I think it was in 2015, but in Australia, a company fired both their CEO and their CFO after a $61 million fraud occurred. They were both sued, and I think they were sued for the 11 million as it states there, but the judge did dismiss that. But again, there's still the threat of employers taking action, and this example is, again, it's just adding to that threat out there that employers are taking action against employees. Okay. So let's get to the first poll question. Let me go ahead and launch that. So what percentage of non-US vendors are in your vendor master file? 0 or less than 90, or I'm sorry, less than 5%, 5% or 10% to 10%, 10% to 20%, 20% to 50%, or 50% or more. You know, and I should have put an I don't know in here because when I talk to clients, one of the first things that I ask when I'm doing the 5-day vendor master file cleanup is how many non-US vendors do you have in your vendor master file? And quite a few of them just don't know. As a matter of fact, quite a few of them didn't or don't know how many active vendors they have across their vendor master files, especially if they have multiple ERPs. And so if you don't know, don't worry about it. You're not alone, but I would definitely take a look at how many non-US vendors you have in your vendor master file, because that lets you know what different things you may have to do when you're doing your cleanup or your onboarding. All right, so it looks like we have most folks have voted, and we have the largest one is 10 to 20%. That's about half of you guys, 10 to 20%. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and we'll go to the next one. All right, so we're going to start with my proprietary authentication validation management process, again, that I use, and I use this for clients that still have manual or fully manual vendor processes to ensure that they are dealing with real vendors and avoiding fraud and those pesky regulatory fines. And then we'll apply that to validations for non-US vendors. So this is just going to be real brief. It's one slide. The first step is authentication, which is the confirmation of vendor data source or the delivery method of the vendor documentation. So the data source is who is sending, and the delivery method can be email or vendor portal or fax or even hard copy. So we're going to, and I do have an authentication workshops that I put on every Thursday. They are paid, and you do need to enroll, but it does help you create an authentication matrix so that you can apply authentication so that you know that you're talking to your vendor and not a fraudster. And this can be requests coming in through email or through phone. Now, the next one, step 2, is validation, and this is where you validate vendor data before it's entered into your ERP, and that's exactly what we're talking about today. Now, to help with this, I do have a vendor validation reference list. It's a free download. You can go to my site and download that, and we'll take a look at what that looks like in a moment, but it does have links which identifies not only resources to verify a vendor is real and not on any watch list, but it's also divided based on the type of information being validated and on which vendor document you'll find it, such as the invoice or a contract. Now, the third step is where you revalidate or inactivate existing vendors in your vendor master file on a consistent basis. So inactivating those vendors you haven't done business with in 15, 18, 24 months, whatever makes sense for your company. And then checking for duplicate vendors and then revalidating active vendor data to make sure that there are no changes and making sure that they have not been added to a watch list since you originally set them up or modified them last. And that's a step that many folks don't do. I do have a recorded webinar. It's on demand, called 8 Steps to Clean Your Vendor Master File when you're doing it manually. And if you need just some direction in how to update or how to clean your vendor master file, that's a good way to go. Now, if you go to my site, Debra Richardson DebraRRichardson.com/webinars, you'll not only see this, but you'll also see another one where I talk about the tools that I use to clean up the vendor master file as well that I use in that process. And all of that is in a e-guide that I have on this whole authentication validation management process. And if you, at the end, if you hang on to the end, I'll have a bonus for you so that you can pick that up at a discounted price. And that e-guide does have 5 authentication techniques, 12 internal controls, 13 plus best practices. So it's really a good deal. Now, the validation is green because that's what we're going to be focusing on today for non-US vendors. So let's take a look at what validations you should be doing for your non-US vendors. Okay. Now, this is the vendor validation reference list that I just talked about. And if you have downloaded this in the past, I recently updated this vendor validation list. So it does include some additional, validations. I added bank account ownership and recently added NS-NOX. So I think I added these two, posted it, and then maybe a week or two later, I added NS-NOX. And we'll talk about why this is significant, but make sure if you don't have this that you go to my site and download it. And if you do have it but haven't downloaded it since September, then go ahead and download it again for the updated version. All right, so validation. So of course, we're going to look at the vendor legal name and tax ID validated against Internal Revenue Service or the IRS records. And this is if you are a U.S. entity, because you are required to follow the IRS regulations. And so you want to confirm, the reason you want to do that is you want to confirm the vendor is registered with the IRS, and it's also another way to validate that the vendor is real and not fraudulent. And the required document is the IRS W-8, whatever version of the IRS W-8 is applicable for that vendor. But for the most part, AP teams, procurement teams, whoever has the responsibility for adding or updating vendors usually receives the W-8 bin for individuals, a W-8 bin E for entities. And one thing about the IRS W-8s is, you know, you've got the U.S. taxpayer identification number field, you got the global intermediary identification number of the GIN field, and then you have that foreign 10. And that foreign 10, you can get anything but the foreign 10 number, right? They put the VAT numbers in there, they put GST numbers in there. Again, you know the drill, just like the W-9, they don't know how to fill that out correctly. And that's why I have created, which I'll talk about later, a global vendor registration number numbers reference list, so that you can match the format of some of those numbers that they may put in that field and use those to validate. Now, how to validate? So for the IRS, there are, you can do that free using their e-services. Registration is required. And the last time that I did that, which was years ago, it took 2 to 3 weeks for that registration to be set up and ready to do the validations. I don't know if that has decreased. I don't think so. But if anyone knows that it's decreased or changed, please put that in the questions, and then I'll let everyone know at when we get to the questions piece. All right. Another way, which is much quicker, but it is a paid way, it is 10check.com via a subscription plan. Okay. Now the next one for non-US vendors, this is kind of big for those countries that require VAT, is the value added tax number against either the VAT information exchange system, which is VISE, or country-specific sites that are not included in the VISE lookup. And again, the reason to validate is you want to make sure that, one, that it's a real vendor, but two, you know, a lot of, even if you don't do it in accounts payable or purchasing, there are your tax teams that may need to reclaim that VAT. And so you do need to make sure that that VAT is valid and that you are collecting it where applicable. And where you would find this is an invoice, or you can request it from the vendor. And then how to validate, again, VISE has, or there's the VISE via the European Commission tool. And then there are various country-specific sites for the countries that are not included on the VISE tool, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. All right, so the next one is the vendor address validated against the Universal Postal Union for non-US, or Google Earth, and or Smarty Streets. And again, confirming that the vendors are not fraudulent, using addresses that do not exist. And you would get that information from their IRS W-8, invoice if the remit address is different, or maybe their fully executed contract. And it is a free validation. You can do that off of the Universal Postal Union. Now, you're not actually going to validate the address. What you will do is find a resource based on the country of they're going to give you a link to a resource that will allow you to validate that format of the format, and in some cases validate that it's correct. It just depends on the resource that they offer, but you will be able to validate that non-US address, at least to make sure that it will get where it needs to go. Format wise. Now, again, you can also use Google Earth, and I haven't used this for non-US addresses where anything specific has jumped out, but I have had team members use it for US addresses where they were able to identify a parking lot next to a liquor store, of all things. And so I have had instances where in the US there have been anomalies or address scenarios that have jumped out as really being not valid. So Google Earth can be good in that regard. And then one that I use a lot when I do vendor validation or vendor vendor validations as part of the 5-day vendor master file cleanup is Smarty Streets. Now, not only will it give you the standardization for your international address, but it'll also give you status. So it will tell you if it is a mailable address, if it is mailable but the address is, or if it matched but the address is inactive, if it matched but the address is vacant. It'll give you a status of the address, not just the standardization of it. So I do like Smarty Streets. It is a subscription plan, but it's one of those resources that you put in, you key in, and you can do it one by one, or you can do it as a bulk. But as soon as you upload it, you scroll down and your results are there. So there's no wait time in it. That part I do like. All right, so the next one is the vendor legal name against specially designated nationals list, SDN, and the block persons list from the Office of Foreign Assets and Control, or OFAC. And so you want to make sure, especially if you're US entities, that vendors that appear on this list are not set up in your vendor master file. And you use again, the vendor legal name from the IRS W-8, and then that validation is another free validation that you can do on the US Treasury site, or that validation is included, which I don't know why I didn't put it here, but that validation is included in 10-check. So if you have 10-check as on the subscription plan, it's included in there. And you'll see I have 10-check on quite a few things here, but if you have it already, definitely use it for OFAC. Okay. And OFAC does have additional 10 sanction lists, which I've listed here as well. So you get quite a few validations from that one search or validation. All right, so vendor legal name against denied persons list from the Bureau of Industry and Security. Vendors that appear on this list will need additional due diligence. So if there is a vendor match, make sure you notify your leadership for more further action. Because it's a legal name, again, you get that from the W-8. And then it is a free, another free validation. You can do a direct search or download a list through the Bureau of Industry and Security. Okay. If you are a governmental entity, you want to verify the legal name against the System for Award Management, or SAM. And the reason to validate is governments are prohibited from awarding contracts to contractor entities that are on this exclusion list. And again, since you're doing the searching by the vendor name, you'll get that from the IRS W-8. And then it is free. It is a free search through the System of Award Management, or SAM. It's also included in the validations on 10-check. Now, if you're a healthcare entity, you want to check that legal name against the exclusion list of Office of Inspector General, or OIG. And reason you want to validate is the OIG has the authority to exclude individuals and entities from federally funded healthcare programs. The required document is the IRS, it would be the W-8 in this case. And then how to validate, again, another free search through the Office of Inspector General, OIG, or it is again included in the 10-check validations. Okay. Now, I talked before about the global vendor registration numbers, and so I did not, and on the vendor validation reference list, that's the free download, it includes the most the US and the most prevalent or frequent validations for non-US vendors, but things like GST, HST, National Identity Card, where each country has its own or can have its own validation source, and where those numbers have specific formats, that's really not anywhere, and it's really country specific. And so what I created was a global vendor registration numbers reference list. And here's just an example of two here, Albania and Belgium. And you'll see that it includes based on the ISO standardization for the country, also includes the region. It includes the type of registration number. It will have the format. So again, I talked before about how you get like different numbers in that foreign 10 on the W-8 that you have no idea. I didn't have any idea what those really mean and what they could be referring to, since 9 times out of 10 they are not a foreign 10 that the IRS issued. In any event, that you can, this will be a great resource to look to see if that's the same format, so you can identify what number that they're giving you. But not only that, but you can identify here whether the validation is going to be the format only, or whether it's going to be a validation. So, and in either event, if it's format only, I do give you a link to get more information on it, or if it's a validation, I will provide that link to how you can validate. So I'll give you, again, wait to the end and I'll have a discount for you so you can get that. Okay. And again, it is 100 plus countries that that's included here. Okay. All right, so now we're up to the second poll question, and let me go ahead and get that launched. All right, so what do you currently require before updating existing vendor bank details? The bank details on bank letterhead or vendor letterhead, voided check, phone call to the vendor, 2 or more of the above, or none of the above. And I'm asking this now because we're going to go into how you can, the next validations will be the bank details. So I'd like to get a quick response to see what you guys are currently requiring when you're updating vendor bank details. All right, so looks like we've got everyone coming in, or most coming in with, all right, so it's changing. Let me give it, I'll probably give it another 15 seconds, so get your votes in, and we'll see what everyone's doing. All right, so it looks like we've got 67%, 2 or more of the above. 33% is none of the above. Oh, wow. Okay, so let's talk about what you can be or should be validating. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. Thanks everyone that voted. Okay. And let's go ahead to validating vendor banking data that you collect. Okay. And so lots of folks are not really familiar with this requirement. So you do need, the same way that you validate the vendor legal name, you need against OFAC, the watch list on OFAC, you need to do the same thing with your vendor bank name. Validate that against a specifically or specially designated nationals list from the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And it's the same reason. If a bank appears on this list, you should not set up that vendor's bank in your vendor master file. Now, typically what I do, because you've got a lot of the big banks, is I'll have excluded banks so you don't have to search them, like Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, those types of things. I'll have a list of like 15 to 20 banks that they don't have, the team does not have to search on because they're not going to be on the list. But any other banks should be searched against the OFAC watch list, and if they appear on that list, then you do not set them up in your vendor master file. And so where can you get that information? Vendor letterhead, bank letter, or my recommended form is a bank branded banking setup form, or branded ACH form, whatever you want to call that, because again, both of these can be forged. But how to validate? So again, you can do that on US Treasury site for free. And again, 10 check is free. All you do is put the bank name in there. You leave the 10 number and everything out. You can still do that validation, and it'll come back validating the bank against the watch list, including OFAC. Okay. The next one is the Vendor International Business Identifier Code, or the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications Code, or SWIFT, so BIC and SWIFT. And this is where non-US banks, or where US banks have the ABA routing number, the non-US banks that don't require IBAN have BIC and SWIFT. And again, you want to, the reason you want to validate is you want to make sure that your ACH or wire payments are processed successfully. And vendor letterhead, bank letter, or my preference, company branded banking setup form is the required document. And there is a free online BIC tool for BIC and SWIFT codes that you can use here. So that's great, that's free. And there is a paid tool called TGBR, and actually I think they've updated the name, but it's with acuity.com, and there is a subscription plan. Now we'll talk about this a little bit more because it should also be on the IBAN, which should be the next screen. So that is a subscription plan. They do have US and non-US banks, and the key there is that they also have historical data. So if banks, merge or acquire each other, if you've got, and the vendors will never tell you if that changes, the history will be in that tool. Okay. So next, we just talked about the IBAN. So here's the slide for that. And again, you want to make sure that your payments are processed successfully for those countries that require the IBAN. And again, same documents, again, recommending the company branded form to collect the data. And then a free way to do that is just to verify it with the vendor bank. There's really no regulated free validation for the IBAN, and if anyone knows of one, let me know, but to my knowledge, there is no regulated free validation, and I don't recommend just going out to Google and Googling it, because I have seen scenarios where in the past my teams have done that, and depending on what tool they click on from the Google search, one will say one thing and one will say another. So I recommend you verify with the vendor bank, or again, TGBR via Acuity. They do have a subscription plan. I believe it's IBAN Complete. Now they're not going to verify the account number, which is included within the IBAN number, but they can definitely validate the format. Now, speaking of validating the account number, what's optional out there is the vendor bank account name and vendor bank account number, validating that bank account ownership. And I know that is a huge thing right now. And you want to verify that you're not sending that payment to a fraudulent bank account. Now, again, required document, you know the drill. I recommend the company branded banking setup form to collect the banking details. And then that bank account ownership it's not a free, it's only available via a paid subscription. And you'll notice here that I do not have GIAC or early warning on here, because both GIAC and early warning and GIAC both use the same database. It's just that early warning, you can get an account with them if you bank with one of their 6 banks. If you don't, then you'll need to reach out to their reseller GIAC systems. But both of them rely on contributions from US banks to populate the database that they use. And so because of that, it is only in the US. They don't have information from non-US banks. And so this resource, NSMAX, I actually did a webinar with them back in July, and they gave a demo of the product. But what it is it really works like a pre-note. They have a database of successful pre-note vendors that they've done in the past. And so if your vendor is not already in there, you would end up sending a link to the vendor to go into the database, update their information, trigger that pre-notification, and then when that comes back successful, then you know that that's the vendor. But because they don't rely on a database being populated by banks the way that Early Warning and GIAC does. They service not only US but also non-US vendors. So that's a resource, and it is via a paid subscription plan. Okay. All right, so last polling question I am going to launch. So one of the things that I found is that, especially when I was a practitioner, is that getting the bank branch and bank account details by country, you know, whether they require an IBAN, what that IBAN format looks like, getting that information broken down by country for us was something that I would have my internal folks just assign someone to do. But for those of you that, you know, just don't have time to do that, would you be interested in purchasing a document that breaks down bank branch and bank account details by country? I have not created it yet, but I am thinking about doing that in the future, because I know that was something that we needed. Although we did that internally, I understand not a lot of people can do that. So if you go ahead and answer here and just let me know if that's something that you're interested in, yes, no, or not sure. And for future, you know, if I do create that, make sure that you're on my mailing list. I do send out emails every Tuesday. They do include information on, you know, what blog and podcasts I've posted, which will be, again, on vendor maintenance, something that will assist you in setting up vendors, valid vendors, and making sure they're not fraudulent. But then you also get notifications of new things that I come out with. So just let me know if that's something that that you're interested in, and get on my subscriber list so you can see when that's going to come out. So I've got some that says yes. Most folks said not sure. So those of you who are not sure, make sure you stay on my subscriber list so you can see if that's going to come out, if you'll be interested. Those that said yes, again, make sure you're on my list so you can see when it does come out. And if you're on my subscriber list, I typically will have a discount for new digital products. All right, so we're going to close that. All right, so I talked about a vendor team or a discount code for attending the webinar today. So if you use webinar 25, that discount code by Monday, 11:59 p.m., you will get 25% off the global registration numbers that I talked about. And if you click on this link, and the links are live in the PDF handout, you can also click on be able to see what 100 plus countries are included. And so if those 100 plus countries are in your vendor master file, then you'll be able to see that they are included. So definitely click on that. And then you will also get 25% off the 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process e-guide I talked about. And then if you want the toolkit, you'll get 25% off of that, and it includes both of these, but you'll also get templates including fillable vendor setup forms, including the banking ACH form I talked about and recommended. You also get templates for desktop procedures, and then also email and letter vendor communications as well. Now, there are some free resources on my site, which we've already talked about the vendor validation reference list. There's also a free desktop procedure template, and also talking about non-US vendors, a W-8 expiration date tracking form, because we know that those W-8s expire December 31st of the 3rd year based on the signature date. So I do have an Excel form that you can use to track those. And then again, free live and on-demand webinars. I talked about one specifically for the cleanup process, 8 steps of clean up your vendor master file. Also talked about tools, one I have for tools that I use when I do that. And then I also talked about one back in July that was with NS Knox, and it had a demonstration of their pre-note database for validating ownership for non-US banks. And then if you like to use any of my services, again, I do have the brochure attached, and I do have a free consultation. All right, so we are right at 10:45 or 10:46, a minute over, but I do want to take some time here and just let you know there is a connect with me slide in here. So please, here's my website, here's my Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to have you as a connection. I also have a link to my podcast, and then I also have, I'm developing a YouTube channel, and every week I have a vendor master file tip of the week. So I have about 4 of them in there now, but it's growing. So make sure you take a look at that and subscribe. And now it is your turn. What questions do you have? All right, so I only have one question here, and it's related to the vendor websites. If I have any suggestions on how to validate that. Yeah, and I know that you guys do, you know, in some ERPs, there is a field for the vendor website, and some of you are collecting that information. Unfortunately, I also know, and you probably do too, that especially with the onset of COVID and remote working, that there's been quite a few phishing sites or sites that are not valid, that have been opened by fraudsters, that are used to trick you to collect information. And they even have that little, they have the SSL certificate, so that gives them the HTTPS, and so you think that it's valid, and it's not. So I actually have a podcast and blog post coming up on this, but there are 2 places that I do, 2 resources to validate that, and that is whois.net, whois.net, and that will tell you how long ago the website was created. So if you're looking at a vendor that should have a, you know, a website that's been should have been around for a while, and you see that that website was just created last week, then you know you have an issue. And what I would do is just copy, especially if you're trying to authenticate, copy that email domain and paste it in there versus typing, because then you'll find where someone was using a capital I instead of a lowercase l. So like apple.com, you know, if you key it in, you're going to key it in with, you know, the lowercase l. But if you copy and paste, you'll see where someone was using a capital I instead of that L. So copy and paste, put it in there, and check the creation date. The other resource that I have, so in addition to the whois.net, it's just really the reverse image search on Google. So if you have a website, and don't pick a picture that's like a Unsplash or, you know, a Shutterstock, some type of a stock photo. Go to the About Us page and grab a pic of, you know, a founder or 2, and use the Google reverse image search and see how many, you know, see if that's attached to other profiles. I also use that for my LinkedIn connections a lot, because there are a lot of fake profiles profiles on LinkedIn. And so if one comes to me that's a little suspect, I will check that. And in the most recent one I checked, I looked at or did the reverse image search, and what came up was that photo was used for a gazillion dental office practices. And so I knew that, you know, I was getting a connection request from a fake profile. So that's something that you can use. And let me see if I have any. It looks like I do have another question that came in. Let me see if I can get to it. What is the purpose of the IRS Form SS4? So that is a very good question. What is the purpose of the IRS Form SS4? So I'm not familiar with that. If anyone that's on the line or on the webinar, if you are familiar with the IRS SS4 form is and how that is used in vendor setup. Oh, okay, I just searched that on irs.gov, and it's the application for the employer identification number. So in this case, I don't think it means anything. Actually, the EIN number, someone can apply for that right online. And I do have a blog about this. I think I posted it last year where I talked about how whether or not you should require an EIN versus an SSN, so you're not storing sensitive data in your ERP, and you can get an EIN in like 15 minutes. So and those folks that have changed EINs, or you know, the legal name and tax ID don't match because they've had the vendor has had a vendor change, name change, or tax ID change, and you know, it takes the IRS some time to update that in their records, so it's showing as not valid. Maybe that's why they're trying to give you the SSS -4 form from the IRS to prove that they've submitted it. But what's better is not that form. What's better is the IRS Form 147C. And that IRS Form 147C is what the IRS will issue to a vendor to let them, to tell them what their legal name and tax ID is within IRS, so that even if it's not in their records yet. So if you have a vendor and you're getting an unsuccessful match on the match with the IRS records, then have them give you or ask for the 147C form, and they can even call the IRS, and the IRS will issue that to them so that they in turn can give it to you. Because again, the IRS records sometimes do not are not always updated, and so that 147C is how you can set them up, even though you don't have a match in the IRS database yet. Not with that Form SS4, which is the application for employer identification number. And so I hope that that answered your question. I hope that's why you were asking. Feel free to reach out to me at that email address if I did not answer the question the way that you in the context in which you ask. I'll be happy to answer that in further detail. And it doesn't look like we have any additional questions, so I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Again, if you have any questions that you think about after the webinar, feel free to email me. And don't forget about the bonus webinar 25 that gives you a 25% discount on the global vendor numbers, registration numbers reference list, the e-guide, and the toolkit, through Monday, November 16th, 11:59 p.m. So thanks, everyone. This now concludes this webinar.